So we have two parallel sessions, and then again we have a research presentation from a project funded by CCAT. Professor Yafeng Yan will be presenting in the other room, and then this room we will have a panel talk about transportation equity. It will be moderated by Taro Fabusuyi, I'm going to introduce him, and then Taro will introduce his panelists. Taro is assistant research scientist in the Human Factors Group at the University of Michigan's Transportation Research Institute. His research interests are in urban systems and operations research, specifically designing and implementing initiatives that support sustainable and resilient community with a focus on efficiency and equity issues. Drawing on both quantitative and qualitative data, Taro's research develops and applies hard and soft operation research method to urban systems issues in a manner that emphasizes theory-driven solutions with demonstrated value added. A central theme of Taro's research activity is the use of demand-side interventions via information and pricing strategies in influencing public's travel behavior with the objective of achieving more beneficial societal outcomes. Informed by the proliferation of big data and influence of transportation in the urban sphere, these research activities are categorized broadly into three overlapping and interdependent areas: intelligent transportation systems, emerging mobility services, and urban futures. Before joining as the research faculty at UMTRI, Taro was Planning Economist at the African Development Bank and the adjunct economics faculty member at Carnegie Mellon University. He also received his Ph.D. in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome, Taro.
Let's go. Version. Fine. How about that?
It's up there. So.
Okay. Henry, thanks a lot for the introduction. So, the issue of equity is really topical, even more so with the Biden administration. I could recollect when they came in January 2021, there were four priorities of the government. One is economy, and the other one is environment, the third is equity, and the fourth one is racial and social justice. And actually, when you see some of the funding mechanism that they've put in place, you could see that they want to put some bite behind just the bargain. So if you take a look at the raise grants, if it's just kind of the boilerplate message from the raise grants, you could see that a lot of the resources, it's tied both to sustainability and then equity issues. And I think this is what we'll be focusing on today. But in the interest of time, we have just one hour. And I really want to make this very interactive, essentially to draw in the audience. And so we want to make it more forward-looking, kind of a nod to the theme of this symposium, looking at equity within the context of shared mobility, but actually to maybe with some connected and autonomous vehicles, some inventions, some innovations in those areas tagged into it. So we have an excellent panel today that will be deliberating on this issue. With me today, so this will be joined like an hybrid. With me is Dr. Nadia Gritza, who is a professor of civil engineering at Purdue. Can you come up? So that's Nadia. And then joining us today will be Josh Johnson. So Josh actually comes wearing multiple hats. He used to be at the city of Minneapolis, but is now with SPIN as a senior public policy manager. And joining virtually is Richard Ezeki. Richard is a director of infrastructure and engagement at CHP Planning. Before then, he was with the Union of Concerned Scientists, with the Congressional Black Caucus, and then at the Urban Institute.
Greetings.
We have a fourth panelist. Once he comes on board, I will introduce him. But I think for now, we just run based on that. So this is the way I'm trying to motivate this conversation today. I really want Josh, Nadia, and Richard, that each one of you will introduce yourself, okay, within the context of these engagement. So essentially looking at your body of work in a manner that where this overlap of equity, shared mobility, and CARBs intersect. As much as possible, if there are like real life examples that you could use to illustrate that, that will be extremely helpful. So I think the way we're going to do this, we will start with ladies first. So Nadia, would you want to go first, please?
Okay. It's not covering.
Okay, is it on?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So I'm Nadia Griza, professor of civil engineering for the university. I'm with the Transportation Infrastructure Systems Group, and I also lead the Sustainable Transportation Research Group. And the focus of this research lab is to look at the direct and indirect impacts of conventional transportation modes and technologies, as well as emerging modes such as shared mobility services, electric vehicles, connected and autonomous vehicles. And we are very interested in understanding the distribution of those impacts across diverse users, diverse population groups, but also diverse geographical settings. So we look at urban, rural areas, underserved communities. And in order to do that, a body of our work focuses on understanding public acceptance, specifically for new technologies, again, shared mobility or electric vehicles or autonomous, the propensity to adopt these services, what are the incentives that might work better than others, and what are the barriers to wider, let's say, spread adoption of these technologies. So we have been fortunate to have received funding from CCAT over the years to look specifically about public acceptance of autonomous and connected vehicles, anticipated impacts on energy and the environment, but also health and active travel. So if we think of autonomous vehicles used as door-to-door services, what would that be in terms of the physical activity, and would people stop using even walking or even stop using going to get a ride-hailing services, bike sharing, and so forth. Another role that I have is I serve as the campus director of a National Science Foundation-funded engineering research center. We are actually on the second year of the center, and it's called ASPIRE. It stands for Advancing Sustainability Through Powered Roadway Electrification. And the mission of the center is to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles and provide ubiquitous charging and affordable and seamless charging experiences. So in order to do that, we really need to understand the barriers to widespread adoption, and infrastructure being one. And with the new bill, we've seen that barrier kind of lifted with a lot of the investment that's going to happen. But we also want to make sure that investment happens strategically in areas where it's needed. We really need those high utilization rates so we can achieve the benefits that this technology promises, especially in the environment. But we also, if we look into investing in those underserved communities, we really need to understand if they're going to use it, who will use it, and if they will reap the benefits of these technologies. And these communities are the ones who are disproportionately affected by increased air pollution and lower quality of life. So when we look at electrification of our transit corridors or truck freight corridors, these are great opportunities to improve the health and well-being of these communities. So that's kind of in a nutshell some of the problems my group is working on, and you can find all of my students in the table in the back.
Thanks a lot, Nadia. Josh?
Thanks. I'm Josh Johnson. I'm a senior public policy manager with SPIN. We operate shared bikes and scooters in 80 plus cities and campuses, including right here in Ann Arbor. Equity is certainly one of our core values, and we work to deliver that in a number of ways. We have our SPIN Access program, which is intended to provide low-income users with access to our vehicles at a reduced rate. So essentially, as long as you are eligible for like a local, state, or federal aid program and you provide documentation for that, we offer our SPIN Access program. We also have a text unlock service, which allows for those who don't have a smartphone or don't have a data plan, which can support use of our app to be able to just simply text unlock a vehicle and then lock it back up again once your trip is done. And then we also offer cash payment options and other means for those who may be unbanked or underbanked. We, in addition to our SPIN Access program, have delivered a few different I would say pilots and programs aimed at kind of better investing or enabling those communities that are generally underserved, whether that's by existing modes or infrastructure or both. We have a streets program where we intend to pilot like quick builds interventions to help establish safer infrastructure for all users, not just those who might be biking or scooting on SPIN vehicles. We also have a mobility data for safer streets program ongoing, where we offer access to local advocacy organizations, a number of data tools to be able to better equip them to understand and advocate for improvements in infrastructure in their communities, with a particular focus on equity in the organizations that we're working with. Okay. And then we've also recently launched a universal basic mobility pilot in Bakersfield, where we're providing access to our vehicles and then offering access to an unlimited transit pass for a year period, with the understanding of, or with the intent to understand how this impacts access to jobs, job training, healthy food, healthcare services, social services. Really, how do we remove those barriers to transportation that can prevent someone from essentially realizing, who they can be, otherwise. And in Bakersfield, we're focusing on young adults who have aged out of foster care with an organization called the Dream Center, and trying to reduce the barriers they face in mobility today. We're also going to be launching a pilot in Pittsburgh, hopefully in the next month or so, with a suite of mobility services, including the local bike share system, a local shared moped service, the transit system, Zipcar, and Waze Carpool, with the same intent, and then working with Carnegie Mellon and UC Davis in each respective pilot to really make sure we have a robust evaluation of those pilots, and really hoping to start a movement along the lines of universal basic income, where there's now 30 plus cities, and I think broad recognition of the value of those types of social safety nets. With my time at the city of Minneapolis, I oversaw all of our work with new and shared mobility. Essentially, any mobility buzzword you can think of, I worked to take on. And our intent was really to harness new mobility to achieve the goals that we had for our city as outlined in our transportation action plan. And, that was, of course, centered on equity, but also climate change and safety and a number of other initiatives. And so working on mobility as a service pilots, we established, I think, the first broad mobility hub pilot in 2019, which is now kind of gaining momentum in a number of other places. We also did a lot of work with mobility data and curb mapping and really trying to get a broader understanding of the landscape of mobility services in our city. And what we tried to do was lead with the intention of, do those communities that may be currently underserved, that we're trying to serve with these various pilots, do they actually want these things? And in the context of the private sector and that dynamic of moving fast and breaking things, that doesn't always equate with the idea of engaging those communities who may not understand, may not have previously had access, or may not be interested in using shared bikes and scooters, car share, autonomous vehicles, you name it. And so we really tried to bring some intentionality to engage those communities when we considered implementing those pilots, those mobility buzzwords that I referenced, and that's definitely colored my experience during my time with Spin and the work that I've been involved in on the policy side. I'll also note, before overseeing in my advanced mobility manager role with the city of Minneapolis, I was the on-street parking manager. And so that was an interesting, look into like the emotional need that people have for parking in cars. And, it's an unfortunate dynamic that is, still pervasive today and really, I think, holds back the potential for shared mobility and transit and the need to reimagine them both really, going forward. And hopefully the momentum at the federal level that Tayo referenced is something that we can catch on to and help to bring better outcomes when it comes to our work in the shared mobility space and the public sector's efforts to try and deliver pilots like this.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. So I'll reach out. Hezekiah.
Let me go next. Reach up.
Good morning. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. All right. Well, just want to again say thank you for Tayo and the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute and the Center for Connected Automated Transportation for allowing me to talk with you and share with you my thoughts on this most important panel. This is actually my third time being part of CCAT. The last two times I was in person and was sharing and talking about this exact same topic. So I kind of have an interest and some background experience in talking about this. Unfortunately, I couldn't join you in person today, but I'm looking forward to I was able to share with these comments with you here and virtually. I am a graduate of the University of Michigan, so this is why this conference is so very important to me. It's great to talk about issues that I'm passionate about with my alma mater and people that are affiliated with this great university. So again, thank you and happy to have the opportunity to be here. So my name is Richard Ezeki. I currently work as the Director of Infrastructure and Engagement at a small urban planning firm called CH Planning based in Philadelphia. We operate in Philadelphia, also Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Boston, expanded to other areas across the Northeast and the country. We focus on transportation planning, land use planning, community engagement, particularly within the aviation and transit industries. We're about 25 people strong. We're a Black and woman-owned minority firm. So if you're interested in working with a group that does engagement across different cities at the local and neighborhood level, please reach out to us. So that's my little spiel and plug for my company. But how I'm related to this topic is that as Tayo said in my introduction, I've worked at a number of different nonprofits, particularly focusing on the policy aspect of transportation equity. As I mentioned, my first foray into this space was at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. I spent a 2-year fellowship there focusing on the impacts of transportation and environmental justice on African American communities. So that's where I was really introduced to transportation equity as a whole. And after the 2-year fellowship, I went to the University of Scientists from 2017 and 2019, where I served another 2-year fellowship. And that's where I got into this intersection of transportation technology and equity. So in that fellowship, we worked with the DC Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is called the Transportation Planning Board, and we did a study where we assumed that in 2040, if the area was with 100% fully autonomous fleet, what would be the impacts on job access, transit access, and congestion, and how that connects to also environmental emissions. So that, again, is my first foray into this intersection of transportation technology, shared mobility, and equity. In our work, we did find that if we compared to 2040, which assumed that there'd be 1.1 million jobs that accessible by a 45-minute commute in the DC area. If you had a fully autonomous fleet, again, it's just where everybody had a fully autonomous car, that job access would increase about 10% from that 1.1 million up to about 1.3 million jobs accessible at 45-minute commute. When we incorporated the variable of carpooling, so instead of having a single occupancy vehicle, autonomous fleet, we would encourage people to ride 2-3 passengers per car. We saw that job number accessible automatically double. So in that research, we tried to show that the importance of carpooling, and also if you look at it from an environmental standpoint, electrifying these vehicles could have a profound impact on job accessibility in the DC area if we look to a fully autonomous fleet. We published that in February 2019. We were able to share that information, that report, with a number of different partners in the DC region as a whole. And then after that, I came over to the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit research firm based in DC as well. And at Urban Institute, where I was there from 2019 to 2021, we actually published a report on new mobility in medium-sized cities. I looked at the medium-sized cities being between 200 and 300,000 people, and looked at the impact of shared mobility on those communities and how they can incorporate partnerships with the ride share and the mobility companies to better provide access for residents in those cities. And then moving on to that, I came here to the siege planning to continue work on urban planning issues, as I mentioned earlier. So this topic is really important to me. I've come at it from the policy side. I've worked on particularly AV impacts on communities, electric vehicle impacts on communities. And as we see that these technologies are starting to grow, especially in the share mode, we need to think about how these technologies can promote accessibility, to promote access for communities to get to, as Josh referred in his comments, jobs, healthcare, housing, drug education, and the like. So I look forward to sharing my thoughts and answering the questions, and look forward to a good discussion. Thank you, Tayo.
Thanks a lot, Richard. So joining us too is Todd. Todd Littman is the founder and executive director of Victoria Policy Institute in Victoria, British Columbia.
So, greetings, everybody, from Victoria, British Columbia. I'm sorry I can't be there physically, but we're taking advantage of one of the new emerging technologies, telecommunications, as a substitute for physical travel. So, unfortunately, my schedule didn't allow me to physically travel to Michigan, but I'm there in spirit. So, I'm really interested in these issues. My emphasis as my research for the last 3 decades has been on comprehensive analysis. So, I often work to encourage environmentalists to be concerned about social equity issues, and people concerned about social equity issues to be thinking about environmental and economic impacts, and be able to develop frameworks to identify the win-win strategies, the ways that we can achieve multiple planning goals together. So I have been very interested in social equity analysis, transportation equity analysis. I've written quite a bit on the subject and done many studies and consulting projects. On our website, dtti.org, you'll find my comprehensive report evaluating transportation equity, and a summary is published in this month's ITE journal, Institute of Transportation Engineers Journal. It identifies 5 major categories of transportation equity. One is the fair distribution of public resources. The second is minimizing external costs. The third is making sure that people with mobility impairments of any sort, including people who cannot or should not drive or have physical disabilities, have a high level of accessibility. The fourth is affordability, so making sure that people with low incomes have a high level of accessibility and mobility. And the fifth is social justice, so making sure that our policies correct for structural inequities. So that's my basic framework, and I go into a lot of detail about how to do that. In recent years, there's been a lot of excitement about emerging transportation technologies and services, everything from e-bikes to ride-hailing services, telecommunication, what we're doing right now, and of course, electric and autonomous vehicles, and maybe even flying cars. So I have my report, Autonomous Vehicle Implications for Transport Planning, went into a lot of detail about how soon we'll be ready to fire our chauffeurs and start relying on robots to drive us around. And last year, my book, New Mobilities, Smart Planning for Emerging Transportation Technologies, was published, and it goes into detail looking at these at a dozen emerging transportation technologies. The key point is, I think we need to do really smart, critical analysis. Much of the information that we have about these emerging technologies is done by the people involved in the industries, people that have a financial interest in promoting a particular emerging technology. So it's important for policymakers and planners, practitioners, and the general public to step back and ask, to what degree does this really help achieve our strategic goals, including social equity? So I'm looking forward to what should be a really interesting discussion.
Thanks, Doug, for that intro. So I think what I'll do next is I will just field questions to you guys. And Nadia, I'm going to start with you. There is a saying that a rising tide lifts all boats, but I think there are genuine concerns that maybe not all boats may be lifted by these new innovations, metaphorically. So I think looking in terms of the true promise of shared mobility, especially for marginalized communities, I mean, from your own assessment, from your work, based on the research and maybe the interaction with folks in the trenches, what do you think the key constraints are? And in what form do you think they could be ameliorated? And so if there are specific examples, I know that you kind of hand-waved to one earlier on, in terms of EVs in underserved communities, I think that would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'll start saying there are several barriers, and we heard before about pilots being in place, and SPIN wanted to find out whether people would use it. So I feel that's major barrier, how people perceive these technologies, what are the benefits they perceive. And also there are several misconceptions and misperceptions, and we've seen these as part of the center I mentioned, Aspire. We have social scientists looking at how, for example, electrification is portrayed in the media. And we've seen different frames come up in terms of equity, accessibility, health. And this is one thing we want to try to help mitigate those biases. We see similar things with also the charging infrastructure, the charging stations. There are a lot of public hearings happening right now. We heard yesterday, Director of Michigan DOT talking about the in-road wireless charging technology. That's actually a technology we're implementing in Indiana, and it's part of our center. And there are a lot of health concerns about this technology, safety concerns, whether you're a pedestrian, how you're going to use it, and obviously affordability and accessibility. So we've been trying, I guess, with the center and the work we're doing with CCAT is try to inform people and also communicate that to different entities, because that's a very complex ecosystem, public sector, private sector, and communities. So we do quite a bit of outreach, obviously, to communities and community engagement. And I'm looking forward to hear more from research and the other panelists, how they go about it. But also doing a lot of stakeholder interviews and focus groups, understand what the experts think, because there's also some communication barriers and language barriers across different entities. And especially when we talk about electrification, putting together transportation and utilities, they haven't worked as much in the past, so there's definitely a learning curve there. So I feel there are so many players, and there are different, I would say, ways to engage and understand their concerns, and a lot of us do surveys, but not all surveys, not all people have smartphones, and not all people, especially online surveys, have access to them. So we really need as you said, to go to the trenches and engage with the communities and listen to them.
Thanks, Nadia, for that. Let me ask Richard this question. Listen, I know that when you were given the introduction much earlier on, you referenced doing a study where you're looking in terms of the number of folks within some commuting distance of what their jobs are. I think I would like you to speak more to that, and if you could weave it within the broader context of how outcomes in other domains of human endeavor. So looking in terms of service delivery, access to health, maybe jobs, affordable housing, how they tend to be shaped by access to destination, and how constraining that is. So if you could speak more to that, looking in terms of what I call like the intersection of transportation and then other domains. Richard?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. And so I think what I'll do and how I'll approach this question is I'll focus on a number of different, what Taya, you said, domains, and how access to destination kind of intersects with those. And we've talked a little bit about those already, jobs, housing, healthcare, healthy foods, for example. And then I'll talk about a few examples that show how shared mobility is impacting some of these domains and impacting people as a whole. And you're seeing like examples from research. We're seeing examples from the corporate side and actual programs and companies themselves, doing actively engaging with communities to help promote more access to these opportunities for a better quality of life. So as mentioned, the first one is jobs, right? That's one of the metrics that many NPOs, particularly at the metropolitan regional level, try to think about how transportation networks over the next 20, 30 years is going to affect access to jobs. As I shared earlier, my example on how particularly a fully autonomous vehicle fleet could affect that job access. But in general, you're seeing that, a lot of local and regional areas are thinking about how they can promote more job access. What many of the regional organizations do is they define, 20, 30 years out, what are going to be their growth areas, where most of the jobs are going to be over the next 20, 30 years, where are people going to be moving, where's the retail, the entertainment. They typically call those activity centers. And so thinking about how those jobs are going to be in those areas and how the importance of having equitable and robust transportation networks can open up other job opportunities for people who are moving into the area. So it's very important to think about how shared mobility, especially incorporating that with public transit, already established public transit routes, can connect to those activity centers, which would then provide more opportunity for people, especially if they're living a bit more further out from those activity centers to get to those jobs. So that's something that's a key consideration. The second domain that I want to talk about is housing. As probably most of us in the room know, that housing and transportation are the two most expensive costs for a family. And oftentimes, that as you live closer to an activity center or a center of economic development, the housing costs there get much higher. And so sometimes it's unfortunate to be able to live near your job or just your commute. You have to live near a job. You have to also sacrifice living further away because your housing, living close to those job centers is so expensive. So people live miles and miles away. They may pay less for housing, but then they also have a longer commute, which of course has its own challenges. So understanding how shared mobility particularly can be either incorporated into current transportation systems, or in terms of what we call transit-oriented development, just developing around these centers in order to build housing in those areas where people don't have to drive, 45 minutes, an hour and a half to get to jobs and their centers is very key. But we also need to think about from that sense, we see that in our planning that when you do transit-oriented development, that comes at a cost. Housing is much more expensive. Developers tend to build higher apartments and 2-bedroom condos that are really expensive too expensive for lower income. So thinking about how to have deliberate investment in building moderate and low income housing is very key in order to understand, to get the benefits of this system. So that's another domain to focus on. The third one I want to talk about is healthcare. I mean, access to healthcare can be the difference between life and death, right? If you don't have adequate access to healthcare, if you're not able to get to your health appointments, your checkups, or emergency issues in a reasonable amount of time, that could be a major issue for someone. So thinking about how building healthcare centers in their communities with mobile transportation options, especially with those who cannot afford or don't have a car, can help people to get to their routine yet important health appointments. Another aspect of looking at not just placing healthcare centers, but for people who may not be able to move close to those areas, looking at shared mobility options, as we talked about, ride share, on-demand transit, even shared autonomous vehicles, which is something that certain companies are starting to build out, could provide access to medicines and to other needs to people who live further away from those healthcare centers. So that's something that I'll talk a little about later in one of my examples. We also look at healthy foods, all right? So we have too many food deserts in this country, especially people who live on lower incomes are more likely to live in a food desert, right? Grocery stores are typically miles away. They're not accessible if they don't have a car, or if their transit system is not as robust and frequent in terms of number of buses or number of trains, then it could take an hour just to get to a train, get to a bus, and it's very inconvenient for many people. So how can two questions on this? How can we incorporate shared mobility into public transit systems in order to provide people to get to those healthy food, to those grocery stores and farmers markets and other healthy food areas, to where they can get access to that food and don't live in the area? Again, we're in long-term issue, building those grocery stores in those current food deserts, and then providing either safe sidewalks or shared mobility services like scooters and dockless bikes, or even mopeds. There's another technology that's being discussed to again get people to get to access to those centers in a very quick way. So that's another consideration to think about. And then last thing, I want to talk about green space, parks, outdoors. The importance of being able to live in an area or have access to those types of experiences cannot be understated, right? Getting access to the outdoors is such a life affirming and important aspect of long-term health. But as we know, many of these areas are inaccessible, especially for those who are lower income. So how do we incorporate, again, connecting current transportation infrastructure with these new modes and emerging technologies, incorporating them together to provide another way for people to get access to those parks, especially if they don't have a car, or the transit networks in their system are inadequate in terms of frequency. So those are just 5 different aspects, and of course we talk about education as one, social services, as Professor Lippman mentioned. Thinking about how share access to these destinations and how shared mobility can play a part is a continuing conversation that needs to happen. And so some examples in terms of how these access destinations play a role. We have companies like Neuro. For those who know Neuro, it's a company I believe based in California that actually delivers. It's an AV company. Doesn't drive people at all, but it delivers food. It delivers goods. It delivers medicines to homes. And so that's another way that one way that shared mobility services are bringing people and bringing services to those in need. As I mentioned about my BCS work and how AVs can impact that. And then also a really cool example that I just saw, I think that was established in November of last year, is that MasterCard and Lyft are coming together to develop this bike share program in the Bay Area. They're building a number of different bike share stations in the Bay Area, and they're also giving free memberships through community partners. I think almost 2,000 to members in the community that may not be able to afford the regular rate. And so these are just again a few examples that show that access to destination is key, and shared mobility has a role to play in that. Of course, as Professor Lemon mentioned, how we need to step back and say, okay, how can we look at this from a neutral perspective and make sure that the development that's happening is going to provide equity for all. So those are just some of the comments that I wanted to share on that. So thanks for that question, Tyler. It was a great one.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Richard. So I think the complexity of what you painted, I want to take that up with you, Josh. And actually, if you could frame it in two ways. So I think maybe the phrase has now been used like this, kind of the triple P, private-public partnership. Private-public partnership, that's number one. And what I want you to do is you wear like multiple hats, So your role right now at Spin, and then your role before in the city of Minneapolis, and how we could do a better job in terms of how we manage these places for the common good, and actually a big skill towards folks who are marginalized or underserved.
Thanks, Tayo. I think, first and foremost, as I mentioned earlier, shared and new mobility has been seen as kind of a thing to be regulated rather than a thing to embrace. And, as I mentioned, that dynamic of moving fast and breaking things has kind of required that from, cities and public sector agencies who are overseeing these programs. And so, often there's that public-private partnership opportunity that you mentioned is missed in the idea that these pilots, these programs, these modes can help reach shared goals together. And it's not just, the private sector is trying to do the least amount it can to, squeeze whatever profit, is available from the cities or campuses where we operate. And that's not true. Certainly we have a different bottom line than the public sector, but, we have broader shared goals, equity, sustainability, safety, those are all certainly factors and aspects of our service that we at Spin really value and try to deliver and invest in cities where we can. And I give the example of Pittsburgh as probably the one we would hold up, where the city was very intentional in framing in 2019 its RFP or bid to bring shared scooters to the city, in that they wanted also this suite of services, kind of a collective to be brought with, those who were applying for the opportunity to operate shared scooters there. And so we worked with the mobility options that I mentioned earlier, Zipcar, shared mopeds, bike share, transit, to bring this, what's now called Move PGH suite of services to the city, and really, hope that we can achieve, much more than our service, the opportunity to operate shared scooters could on its own, which is, not everybody is comfortable or able to use a scooter. We can't be everywhere everyone needs us to be, and neither can any of the other individual modes, transit included. It can't be all things for all people. And so bringing this suite of shared services, we're hopeful that we can, provide that access that Richard was referencing, and the variety of form factors and availability that people often in these underserved or marginalized communities need to rely on. And that's certainly a factor, that equity is not just the disperse or the distribution of vehicles in, equity areas. That's often the most visible thing that city stakeholders rely on as a way to show, they're trying to deliver equity. But it's unfortunately, it misses the mark when it comes to actually taking a holistic approach to equity, because you need to have that education and outreach and engagement. You need to invest in infrastructure. You need to understand what people want and how to deliver it. And so we're working to, expand and hopefully convince others to bring about, those opportunities like I referenced in Pittsburgh, where the program is really based on a partnership approach, which with some regulation, of course. But, that's how we can achieve better results. That's how we can make more investments. That's how we can bring, we are bringing $50,000 to the Universal Basic Mobility Pilot to fund Carnegie Mellon's research. We couldn't make those investments otherwise if it's, the I guess I would say wild west approach where, there's a lack of regulation. Anybody who's interested in operating can, and, there's no meaningful intention to, reach those shared goals together. And that's not every city, but, there's certainly some that are still kind of on that end of the spectrum. So I would say, moving towards that partnership approach is, key to be able to, achieve those shared goals, and particularly with an eye towards equity, allowing us to bring more form factors to the table to, embed ourselves in the community and be able to, actually do meaningful engagement and help people understand and try out our service in a comfortable and safe way. And also, understand how we can do better as, we do that engagement, whether it's with regard to form factors or our low income program or, other pilots or efforts we might undertake to be able to serve more people and really continue to center our work on equity. So I think that's, the importance here, really kind of moving from that dynamic of shared mobility as a thing to be regulated to shared mobility as a thing to be embraced in, that partnership approach.
Thanks. Thanks, Josh, for that. Todd, so I think the next question, the way I will frame this, will be more forward-looking. So let us assume that we have a new era. Let's assume that we have a new regime where shared mobility is widely adopted and cars have been mainstream. How do you think the landscape will change, specifically with regards what the equity implications are?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, let me frame this in this way. There are often trade-offs between mobility, that is the speed and distance that people can travel, and accessibility, which is our overall ability to get what we want, whether it's healthcare services or good, healthy food or jobs or green space. And of course, mobility is part of accessibility, but equally important, in fact, more important, is land use, proximity. So, in fact, one of the great researchers on this, I believe, has taught at the University of Michigan. That is Jonathan Levine, who about a decade ago he and colleagues published a really good paper that showed that a 10% increase in density, in development density, provides far more increase in accessibility than a 10% increase in travel speed. In other words, focusing on travel speed is often a mistake. Planners often say that automobiles are machines for mobility and cities are machines for accessibility. And there are often trade-offs. I mean, one of the examples is just parking minimums. So currently, in most cities, the zoning codes require that anytime you build a building, you have to provide an abundance of off-street parking. And that consumes a bunch of land, so it spreads everything out and encourages people to own more cars and encourages all that vehicle traffic. And so the minimum parking requirements are an example of the trade-off between policies that favor mobility versus policies that favor accessibility. If we want to emphasize accessibility and really and minimize the amount of travel people have to engage in, one of the first things we do is we eliminate parking minimums. So car-free households are no longer forced to pay for costly parking facilities they don't need. That's just an example. Okay, so now let me say that I believe if we really care about efficiency and social equity, we should always put good urban planning at the top. Ask, what does it take to make a beautiful, wonderful urban community, whether it's a small town or it's a suburb or it's a urban neighborhood, regardless of what type of community. The community, the compact, mixed-use, multimodal, efficient management of road space, those are the keys to achieving social equity and efficiency. And so then you can ask, how well does some new technology or some new service contribute to good urbanity, creating better urban communities? And our experience has been terrible. I mean, we know, for example, that when there's good research showing that when ride hailing enters a city, traffic congestion increases. Now, some of us have been saying for decades that cities need to efficiently manage road space and apply efficient pricing, what we call decongestion pricing, so that motorists pay for pay for the cost of the roads. The introduction of ride hailing, and in the future, the introduction of self-driving taxis, is going to make that absolutely essential. A city will fail if we simply allow anybody who wants to introduce self-driving cars, because there will be so much more traffic, potential traffic congestion, unless we change our policies to limit, to either price or regulate out people driving alone and only allow or strongly favor people using shared mobility. So our challenge as planners or policymakers is to envision the policies that will favor the space-efficient, resource-efficient, healthy, affordable modes and compact development over inefficient, inefficient modes and sprawl-oriented development.
Thanks a lot, Todd. And I really appreciate the way you emphasize policies, and then you are the urban planners tagged onto it. In the interest of fairness, I think I would like to involve the audience. Honestly, I still have like 8 to 10 questions to go through, but I recognize that maybe we have roughly 10 minutes left, and that you guys would like to chime in. So just raise your hand and someone will make their way towards you if you have a question. Shane.
Thank you. So first of all, awesome panel. I could ask a zillion questions, but I'll leave it to one. So it's around marketing, education. We talk a lot about public, about outreach, but we mostly talk about outreach to just the communities that we want to serve. And we know that we need a greater public understanding of the technologies that are out there, the services that are out there, because it's going to have to be publicly supported in one way or another. And so I'm just wondering if you thought about or done any study on how public education and more, marketing, even though marketing sometimes is frowned on in the public sector, how does that impact people's willingness to access these new services and general public support for these new services? We need to help people imagine what it would be like, because it's not even in their minds what it would be like to just use shared mobility, or as the other panel was talking, to maybe leave your car parked most of the time and use shared mobility otherwise. So just wondering if that's come into anybody's studies.
I don't have any specific studies to reference, but certainly have some experience with that. When I was with the city of Minneapolis, one of the challenges we had was how do we actually engage people on this? And, it was, I would say, kind of incumbent on us to find a way rather than like push it solely on the private sector. And with that, there's also the challenge that those who show up to meetings or, Zoom or whatever means are probably the most vocally opposed to whatever thing you're talking about, whether it's infrastructure, shared mobility, what have you. And those marginalized communities either, don't have time or space or value their privacy or hold their opinions to themselves. And so I don't have a good response for you other than, it was kind of an effort on our part when I was with the city to take a balanced approach to engage. I was a team of one with the city of Minneapolis. And so I asked for some help from our transportation planning division. And, we did some work to engage with neighborhood associations and others who, had some broader reach. We sent out to like council ward newsletters and other means. We established a survey to try and just get some engagement and ask those questions about, like, particularly scooters. Is this something you want? What when we had launched them, what problems have you seen, or what opportunities continue to exist? How would you change things? So I think it's got to be a combined approach. And when I was again with the city and we had an area in particular adjacent to downtown, very dense area, and a lot of empty nesters living there, there was a pretty problematic park where people were riding scooters and it was affecting pedestrians. It was somewhat narrow sidewalks. And, we pushed the operators at the time to go, and Spin was one of them before I was with them, to go and speak to that neighborhood organization together with us and, really address those problems together. And I think that's, the dynamic in the last question that Teo fielded for me was approaching it as a partnership, and that we as the city couldn't just hope that the private sector did, what they could to engage communities, not only, those who they wanted to serve, but also, those who we may need to like change hearts and minds. And that it had to be a shared approach. And with Spin, we've done a lot of work, particularly with regard to accessibility, to learn how this impacts, people in an adverse way, those who are disabled and, may experience, of course, scooters obstructing the right of way, or, riding behavior that may be problematic. And so we've done a lot of work to engage those communities who, or those organizations who can help us get that perspective and help understand how we might shift our service, establish new features, and otherwise engage beyond our current kind of sphere to improve our service. So,
thanks for that response, Josh. There's a question over there.
Thanks to the panel for all this. My question's about the challenges between balancing walkability and mobility. And specifically, I'm thinking about things associated with autonomous vehicles that provide for a disruption in the relationship between motorized vehicles and pedestrians. Are there best practices or things that you see that really need to be addressed in the near term, as particularly suburban areas are redeveloping how they think about their downtown areas, their DDAs, due to the pandemic?
Todd, can you give a quick response to that, like a 50,000-foot view?
Yeah. So that is exactly the foundation for my message, is that in a healthy, affordable, accessible community, the basic unit of travel is the walk. Walking is the starting point. Now, the walking may be to, at some point, some of your walking trips go to a transit stop or a transit station, or to a parked car. But the point is, walkability is really the most fundamental form of transportation. And in a traditional city, pretty much any neighborhood that was built before 1950, whether it was small town or a streetcar suburb or a city neighborhood, walking, the assumption was most people were going to make most of their trips by walking. And it's only fairly recently that we have this automobile-dependent sprawl where we assume that the unit of travel is the vehicle trip, not the person trip, not the walking trip. So I think we should be, and you frankly, you can't have a truly affordable and healthy and equitable transportation system that is totally automobile dependent. You just can't. Sure, cars and maybe in the future self-driving taxis can, for example, chauffeur around somebody with a visual impairment. But for example, think about the roles that your taxi driver plays in providing service. So if you take a taxi, you know that somebody will help you load and unload heavy packages. If you're in a wheelchair, the taxi driver takes responsibility to make sure that you're in the vehicle and safe, and helps you and a taxi driver will make sure that you actually arrive at the doorstep safe. Okay, a self-driving taxi can't do any of that. So even if we have self-driving taxis, there will probably be people who will choose to pay a premium for the human-driven taxi, even when those robot taxis are all around. Anyway, that's getting off the point of walkability. But my key point is that even with a high-tech future, I mean, think of it this way. In most of the scientific literature, most of the scientific movies that you see, people are still walking around. The Star Trekkers, they were always walking around the Enterprise, and when they got transported down to a new planet, they walked around. And what's the high point of a trip to the moon? The moonwalk. And what's the high point of a trip to a space station? The spacewalk. NASA is just another public transit agency whose job is to support good walkability. And we need to keep that in mind. Any new transportation technology or service should be evaluated in part based on its impacts on walking and bicycling. And that includes the land use component. Does it make sure that people can live within convenient walking distance of local shops and healthcare services and their children can walk to school?
Thanks a lot, Todd. Actually, I like the kind of the humor that that you introduced to that. We have room for just one question, please. So please go ahead.
Really appreciated this panel. Thank you so much. What American metros or states are getting this right and who are going to win the mobility future?
I referenced Pittsburgh. I think, like I said, their partner first approach to mobility has been refreshing, and I think has allowed us to make bigger investments, as I said. And we're also, I didn't mention implementing shared bike and scooter parking and charging stations in Pittsburgh. We've got about 20 kind of embracing that mobility hub concept and infrastructure investment. And that's, the cost of that implementation is well over $1 million. And we're bringing that investment to the city as the private sector. I think I would just reference others, not necessarily any in particular. I don't want to necessarily call out any of our regulators, but, I think others that are starting to embrace the idea of it doesn't have to be prohibitive regulations to prevent complaints and council members and, and constituents from, raising their ire at whatever, mobility service you might be providing. And reducing those prohibitive fees or reinvesting, those fees that were being charged into supportive infrastructure or, things like mobility wallets. I think Adrian referenced in the previous program, Portland's mobility wallet program. I think all of that is kind of, underlying this idea of a partnership approach. It doesn't necessarily have to be like direct subsidy or, an effort to give the private sector free reign of, a city's right of way, but, kind of a balanced approach to regulation and, how do we achieve outcomes and particularly with an eye to equity. That outreach piece is important. The distribution and availability of vehicles, people want price transparency from what we found. And that's on us to make sure we're providing as the private sector. And then also, just being able to continue to understand the needs and we can't be an all-encompassing service that can reach the needs of all, but hopefully we can continue to work towards that, whether it's introducing new form factors, partnerships, or features within our sphere of influence.
So we're 5 minutes past time. Number one, I want to express my gratitude to Nadia, Josh, Todd, and Richard. And then to take some liberties here. As the moderator, I think I should be. You guys should be able to afford me that. So I want to pose 3 questions, essentially because there is no room for us to deal with this. More like food for thought. So Josh just mentioned Pittsburgh. Looking in terms of older cities and the legacies, what would be the ease of being able to snap on these newer ways of doing things? I think that is really, really crucial. The other one is where I think collectively it would benefit us if we could move away where some of these narratives are being driven more by the private sector folks, but more by the society. So classic example, MaaS. The mobility as a service has typically been picked where the issue is in terms of payment. And I think there's a need to move toward more like a truly multimodal consumption system that is equity driven. And finally, this is a global symposium. So the question becomes, if I'm trying to do this in Tokyo, if I'm trying to do this in Vienna, or even in Vancouver, how would the narrative change if it's not the US? So I know that there's no room to deal with these issues now, but I think they are all relevant. And so more like food for thought. Again, no pun intended. Lunch has been served too. So thanks a lot. Thanks all.